Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Nino, and for organizing the conference. So as a preface to this, I work in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, essentially the Department for Energy for the UK. I should strongly emphasize my team is not policymakers. We are very much the technical and scientific advisors that help provide the evidence base to our colleagues within the department and within the rest of government. So if sometimes what we talk about is a little bit not policy heavy, but rather research heavy, please excuse us. That is our role after all. So for a little bit of context, back in 2021, we started thinking within our department, but also in other government departments about the impact of construction of buildings, but in the construction phase and the embodied carbon rather than the operational emissions that are associated with buildings. When this work started to go underway, it was very clear that there were disparate groups across the UK civil service that were thinking about this issue, but there wasn't really a lot of joined up thinking. However, we have come a long way since then, since 2 years ago. And as Kay Tor was saying yesterday from the Infrastructure and Project Authority, there's quite a lot of work going on in the infrastructure side as well. So to give you a bit of an overview, in your direction. Okay. To give you a little bit of a background still, so there is no slides. Thank you. All right. When we were first starting this work, there was quite a lot of interest in understanding what the rest of the world was doing around this, and particularly the policy context and how different countries were approaching this problem. We started speaking to other policymakers and we started speaking to practitioners from other countries, and it became very clear that actually what would be really useful would be an understanding and a review of how whole life carbon assessment is mandated, is undertaken, is incorporated in building regulations across the world. And my colleague Mel, who's just in the background over there, very helpfully organized an international workshop on whole life carbon in the built environment and brought together a bunch of stakeholders from all across the world. That was back in 2022, in October 2022, and it came up. The conference was the workshop was very informative and came up with a lot of conclusions that we decided actually were worth putting into a review of whole life carbon assessment internationally in one report. I do want to, so what I'm going to talk about here is the contents of the report for a bit, and then I would like to invite all of you to edit the report and provide comments when Nino is going to share a link to an editable version of the report, because we would really like your input and the collective knowledge that is in this room and online, of course. Sorry. Thank you very much. So we've categorized our findings across 6 different categories. The national methodology that is adopted in each country, the types of and the details and the level of product data, the databases that are an enabler for whole life carbon assessments, the limit values of the thresholds and how those are implemented. And I'm sure we're going to hear more from the Denmark and the Dutch perspectives as well later. How the policy roadmaps reflect the issues that I'll discuss in a second, and then who actually makes the change, because we're here talking a lot, but it's actually these things need to happen on the ground on the construction side. So obviously all of this starts from the international standards, the EN and the BS and RK standards, but it's really important to understand the local context and the national context when specific national methodologies are developed. So what we did was we tried to identify common principles from the different methodologies developed in different countries, but also importantly, we wanted to identify the key differences and what needs to change from country to country, reflecting the availability of data, reflecting the specific circumstances of industrial production, of, say, electricity and energy supply. So, for instance, we have some countries that have developed national methodologies that can inform the process for other countries that haven't really undertaken that yet. And actually, in the UK, about a month ago, we launched with government support what's called the RICS, or Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors Professional Statement on Whole Life Carbon Assessment, which is the UK's latest version and interpretation of the international standard on whole life carbon assessment. So we've collected learnings from a bunch of different countries, so Switzerland, Brazil, Tunisia, New Zealand, but also UK and EU. And we've produced some principles that we thought are common across the methodologies. And I won't go through all of these now, but I think some important ones to outline are things like a transparent and publicly accessible database is really important, with clear quality markers for the different types of data that go into the methodology. I think one really key one that we don't really discuss very much in these workshops of experts is the training of the people who actually undertake these assessments, and whether they are capable of actually undertaking the assessment to an acceptable quality and producing good data. Moving on to the actual product data, it is clear that different countries calculate and report product data very differently. And there is, we want to say that there's a need to align how we calculate and report the product data, but of course, like I said earlier, sometimes that's not possible. And we're talking about different countries, different contexts, where you might need to accommodate those differences in a national methodology. Of course, when international trade comes in as an issue, then it is a little bit of a slightly more complicated story, because you have products crossing borders. You need to account for the emissions of products produced in other countries. But I have an example up here, which is on the left, the UK sort of standard, and on the right is the Brazilian database and the mandatory requirements around that. And one key difference is the life cycle stages that, for instance, Brazil uses, which is they only require stages A1 through to A3, whereas some of the other standards will require more life cycle stages. And that is, for instance, a very, very key methodological difference that we need to be aware of when we are comparing different product data, and particularly, as we heard yesterday, different type 3 EPDs. Moving on to how we actually collect the databases. There's a good example here of understanding that not every product is going to be the same. So we've got a concrete block in Nigeria that is sort of standard 9-inch, but then the UK equivalent might have the exact same name, but it is slightly different in dimensions. We need to be able to account for those differences. That is why transparency in the databases is actually pretty crucial, and the data sources need to be publicly available. Like I said earlier, we need to have clear quality markers of the data that goes into these whole life carbon assessments. So it is there really to understand that there are slight variations between different products across different countries. There are variations in the cement mixes, for instance, or there are variations in the electricity mixes. There are data gaps that need to be acknowledged. I think one of the interesting topics that has been discussed in this conference as well is the sort of limit values or the thresholds and how those evolve over time. We are going to hear from some of our European colleagues on how they've done that, but actually you can see we've included the Danish standards there. We heard an interesting case from the EPA and the federal buy clean version yesterday. But the key thing is that in order to be able to set achievable and ambitious targets, you need good data. And you can't really go out and start waving data and waving limits in front of people when you don't have that backed by already undertaking good quality whole life carbon assessments. Ramble undertook a study, I'm sure quite a few of you are aware of the study, and found that the top 5 countries with sort of more than 50 case studies are France, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, and Belgium. And they are taking different approaches to develop their benchmarks, but they are all managing to do that because they do have the data available. We've put on the slide there a comparative sort of graph of the GLA, so the Greater London Authority targets and embodied carbon, sort of building level embodied carbon or whole life carbon targets. We've compared that with the Danish targets, and then there's the RIBA, so the Royal Institute of British Architects as well. But all of this, for all of these assessments to happen, there needs to be an enabling environment. And we spoke yesterday a lot about public procurement in the UK. By 2025, that accounts to about 200 billion pounds, sorry. And that we believe that that's a good lever to pull on. However, there are other initiatives. So more specifically, we are looking, at least the UK, we're looking to make whole life carbon assessments mandatory in public procurement through the construction playbook. And then there is the IDDI, the Industrial Decarbonization Initiative, which aims to do something very similar on a much grander level. Yeah. To calculate. So the construction playbook mandates the calculation of whole life carbon assessments for projects in what's called the government major projects portfolio. I don't exactly remember the limits for what needs to what counts as a major project, but it's the calculation right now. It's not the limit yet. There are voluntary sign-ups to limit and reduce whole life carbon, but it's currently not regulated, at least in the UK. So coming up to sort of the last bit is how exactly we reduce embodied carbon in practice. And the important thing is that there are quite a few different actors that can make this happen. Obviously, we have on the very high level, the standards and the standard developers and the governments that enable these standards to become good practice. But really, it's the material manufacturers that need to get their act together. It's the construction site and the construction developers and the project developers. It's the engineers and the architects, and it's also the financing, to be honest. And we have heard a little bit. I remember I was in a session yesterday where we were speaking about will there be enough financing for people who want to clean up their industrial sites, for instance, but equally for developers who want to develop, say, housing projects with improved whole life carbon. So we've outlined in the report in more detail that I don't want to cover now in this presentation, but we've outlined the roles and the levers that some of these different actors have to pull on. And we would very much like to hear what you guys have to say and your thoughts. Oh no, sorry. Beyond the whole life carbon report, I just really wanted to outline some initiatives that we're taking right now. We've got, this is a little bit out of date, this slide, but we currently have a research project on whole life carbon assessments in housing and what that impact, what undertaking whole life carbon assessments has as an impact to developers. Does it increase the cost? Is it a big overhead cost for the developers? This is run by the Department of Housing, essentially. They have a longer acronym, but I don't want to spell it all out. We've got some research that's about to kick off within our department in partnership with the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and it's around timber and understanding the role of timber in construction, how embodied carbon changes when you incorporate timber and the impact of end of life sort of routes for timber products. We also have, my colleague Mel is about to kick off research on data quality and data uncertainty around product level LCAs. We do have a supplier day where we are looking to speak to potential organization who would like to undertake this research. And I'm hoping we can include a link to that with the report for the attendees to join. I think Jane Henderson, who's on the call online, is joining in that supplier day. I think that is it from us. Thank you.